Sunday School teacher, I'm glad that you have joined us for our time of study and preparation. We are working on the Bible study for Sunday, January 21st. You've got your outline there and your Q&A time, so you got all you needed to get ready for this. So let's jump in there and do some work on getting ready for January 21st. The title of this lesson is Value All. And we're going to take a little side street here on our study in Acts. We're going to look at a story that we covered earlier and then go back into the Old Testament to help us in this Bible study. Basically, what we're doing in this session is the Sanctity of Life Day for Southern Baptist churches. That's this Sunday. And so this lesson is going to look at Acts chapter 16, and we're also going to take some verses from Psalm 139. The point of this lesson, what we're wanting to get across, is that Christ values every person, so we should not exploit or disregard others. And so, like I say, this is the Sanctity of Life Day in Southern Baptist churches. When I was getting ready for this and reading this passage and thinking through all this and this story from Acts chapter 16, I thought about an experience that I had a couple of years ago preaching in Haiti, just maybe a year or so after the earthquake there. And one of the churches that I preached in, and their churches there were not anything close to what our buildings are like. This is just it was a raw brick building, and over the top was not a roof, but basically was a blue tarp. And so that was their church building. When I got there, beautiful, beautiful location, right there on the ocean, the beach, right down. No resorts, of course, because this is Haiti, but it's a beautiful location. And there, as I gathered with them before church, before the worship began, I noticed in the congregation that it was all women, and this was probably an hour, 45 minutes before service started, and it was all women and children. And I basically asked the pastor, where are the men? And he said, there are no men. He says, all these ladies that you see are all former prostitutes that have been reached with the gospel, and those are their children. And so this church was making a difference in the lives of these women who used to be objects rather than being valued as a person that was created in God's image. And so that's what we're looking at today. Today's study highlights the calling that we have as followers of Jesus to value every person just as God values them. This calling demands that we reject attitudes and human systems that exploit or devalue vulnerable human beings, whether the preborn children in the womb of their mother, or people with disabilities, maybe even the powerless, or even the elderly. We have to value, and we must value, each life. So let's look at the story in Acts, and then we'll look at our passages in the Old Testament. But Acts chapter 16, and we'll look at verses 16, 17, and 18, and there we'll see the freedom gained. Once, as we were on our way to prayer, a slave girl met us who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She made a large profit for her owners by fortune telling. As she followed Paul and us, she cried out, "These men who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation are the servants of the Most High God." She did this for many days. Paul was greatly annoyed, turning to the spirit, he said, I command you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out right away. So remember that Paul and his missionary journey, their typical way of doing ministry was they would go into the synagogue and preach and connect. Well, this community did not have a synagogue, but they had a group of women that gathered for prayer, and so that's where Paul and his group were going every day, going with these women to a time of prayer. And so here Luke says, one day we were on our way to meet the women for prayer, and we had this slave girl that was possessed by a demon. And that's what we see in verse 16. Her masters only cared about her because of the profit that she made for them. They did not value her as a person, nor did they care about those who were deceived by her practice. This was not some innocent, playful fortune-telling thing. This was not like getting a fortune cookie at the Chinese restaurant and having a good laugh about the message that it has. It's not this was a demonic exercise. And so when it says fortune-telling, the word that is used there is the source of information was demonic. That it was the devil's angels that gave her the insight. It says here that this woman with this girl, this young lady that was a slave, followed them, and she continually followed Paul and the team, and she kept shouting an oracle about the men. The slave girl's oracle did not make clear which God or type of salvation she meant. In the verse there, it says in verse 17, says, these men who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation are the servants of the Most High. What she said there was more of poking fun at them, saying, oh, these guys are telling you they know God. They know God. And so she was going around questioning them through, of course, the demonic influence. And we see in verse 18 that this continued for several days. And it got to the point where it says that Paul was greatly annoyed. He was thoroughly aggravated with her provocative activity. She was driving him crazy. And then Paul finally said, I've had enough. And that wasn't the focus of his ministry. This was not his focus. He could have done this weeks or days before. But finally he said, in the name of Jesus, come out. And that's important because Paul did not give the girl deliverance from her spiritual bondage. Jesus is the one who gave her freedom. Well, let's look at the complaint in the following verse 19. In verse 19 it says, when her owners realized that their hope of profit was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace to the authorities. And if you remember a couple of weeks ago, that's where we picked up the study. But here is the complaint. And it may have been several days after verse 18. But whenever it occurred, it was sometime later. They realized that their source of income was gone. And they got mad. They were so mad that they seized Paul and Silas. And we need to understand this is not some little bitty Barney Fife citizen's arrest approach. This was serious. They aggressively knocked them to the ground. They secured them, and they hurriedly drug them to the center of the city. In other words, this was very aggressive. This was the beginning of a great pain for Paul and Silas, and a memory that Paul would carry his entire life and scar him for the rest of his life, physically and emotionally. They were taken to the authorities to hear the charges against them. So we've got this life, this girl who was not valued. And the only reason that she was valued by these owners was the profit that she gained for them. She was their slave. Look at verse, we're going to go to the Old Testament, Psalm 139, verses 13 through 16. And there it says, For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you because I have been remarkably and wondrously made. Your works are wondrous, and I know this very well. My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret and when I was formed in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw me when I was formless. All the days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. And here we see that every life is valued by God. Every human life is valuable and important. In Psalm 139, David moved from reflecting on God's knowledge. That's what we see in verses 1 through 6. And we see God's presence in verses 7 through 12. To now he is marveling about how God was so perfectly and intimately involved in His creation. He uses the word inward parts, and that's translated for the word kidney. And there it means that God is involved in the smallest details in creating life. He says you created. He's talking about being brought together, pulling together. He says you knit me together, and that's personally involved in making. And then he talks about the mother's womb, that God is actively involved in the creation of each life. And so we see in those verses how God is involved in creation. And life does not begin at birth, but life begins at conception. Our response and our attitude toward life should be that of gratitude and thanks to God. And that's what we see in verse 14. He says, I am remarkably made. What David says is, life's a miracle. And it is. And he says that we are wondrously made, amazed. So it's surpassing our understanding. It's beyond our knowledge. Basically what David is saying is, I don't understand it, but I know you, God, and you made me. David states how he knows God in verse 15. He talks about the bones, that's the strength. God was his source of his strength, not himself. David didn't say, I'm a self-made man. He said, God is my source. God was there when he was conceived in his mother's womb. God was there. The psalmist then pictured God looking down on his creation in verse 16. The formless does not equal lifeless. There have been those that have said, it's okay for us to abort babies because they're formless. No, that's not what that is saying. There is life. David's life and his death, that's what it says in verse 16, his life and his death are known to God. Yes, God knows all, but yet He gives us the freedom of choice. He never forgets one of His creation. So, as we think about this lesson, what are the main points? One, believers must seek to take action as advocates for people who are devalued and marginalized. Number two, society should be challenged to examine the motives behind businesses that profit from the devaluing of human lives. And then finally, believers are to value all human life. So what are some things that we can do to create interest in this lesson as everybody's gathering? Well, just ask the group to discuss how you have taught your children or your grandchildren to value all human life. What ways did your parents teach you to value all human life? Just discuss how you learned the importance and how you've taught others to value human life. And then finally, in the application, discuss what you or your class can do in partnering with a local Christian ministry that works in valuing every human life. It could be a soup kitchen. It could be a crisis pregnancy center. Or it could be a house for unwed mothers or some other type of ministry that connects with those who are devalued by society. But do something as an individual or a class. And so I'll be praying for you as you teach this lesson this coming Sunday. God bless you.